即将在1分钟之后开始，请尚未入场的会众请尽速入场。那么接下来的主题是 parsing OSDC， 那我们很高兴邀请到 Ingy döt 来为我们做这一场的分享，谢谢。
I would like to give a live demo. It's KTV time. Sing along if you know it. Let's bash. Put on your red pill and hack the blues. Let's bash to the text they're typing in the terminal. Hello. My name is Ingy döt, and today I want to show you the hot new language of 2014. Bash. Seriously? Seriously? Okay, so the subject today is Bash as a modern programming language. Bash is a little bit older than Perl. Perl's from '87, and Bash is from '89. It evolved from Bourne Shell originally. It was actually, I just read about this on Wikipedia this morning. It was actually one of the only projects funded back in the day by the Free Software Foundation. Brian Fox was given money and to get it going, and he did, because the shell was deemed to be, I think there were licensing problems and whatnot with the Bourne shell, and that wouldn't sit right with RMS, who will be here next month. So, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's on Linux, OS X, Windows, and more. But most people don't think of Bash as something that you program. It's something that maybe you write some scripts in, but usually you just use it as in a terminal. And if you're really cool, you don't use it at all because you're using Z shell or Fish or some newer shell. But that does not mean it's not a good programming language. These people are wrong who think that you can't program it seriously. So, personally, I'm interested in a lot of different languages, and I'm actually interested in creating some new languages, but the programming languages that I use day to day in my work every week are Perl, Ruby, JavaScript, and Bash. And I feel comfortable when I start a project or when I'm working on a project picking up one of those and going with it. But probably in the last 6 months, if I'm going to write anything that's command line, I'm definitely going to reach for Bash first now that I've learned to become a modern Bash programmer. So it started last year when I wrote a new command for Git called GitHub. So you say git space hub space repo new or clone or hub clone, or I gave a talk on it. How many people were in my last talk where I talked about the GitHub tool? Okay, so we'll see it a little bit today, but basically you can do all of your day-to-day Git interaction from the terminal, and you can do really powerful commands with one-liners, like you can clone every repo in a Gov0 organization, for instance. You could star every repo. You could follow all the followers of all of your followers. with a single command. So you could add all of the members of Gov0 organization as collaborators to all of your repos in one command. That's really powerful. It's really, GitHub is fantastic, but but doing serious GitHub stuff through the web interface, it's no good. Their API is fantastic, and that's what that's about. But let's talk more about Bash. So when I was starting to program this, you know, all of the Git commands are actually individual files, and most of them are symlinked or hard linked back to the Git binary, which is in C now. But originally it was just a bunch of Perl scripts, and you can write Git in a whole bunch of things. So I was looking at one, and it was written in Bash, and I'm like, huh, that's interesting. And then I read through it, and I'm like, huh, it's not actually too bad. I'm going to try programming in Bash, but I'm going to program it just like I would program in Perl, Ruby, or JavaScript. And if it lets me down in a way that I can't easily get around, or well, not always easily, but if it lets me down, I'll quit. But Bash, it ended up never failed. I was able to create a GitHub is probably it's thousands of lines. I mean, it's a big project, and it's probably the same amount of code on order with what a Perl or Ruby project would be. It's not thousands of lines because it's Bash. So my MO basically was when I ran into something like, how do I concatenate, how do I join an array into a string? Okay, then I would just ask Google. Or how do I do this thing that I do in Ruby? I would ask Google. In Bash, I would ask Google, and I'd generally end up on some Stack Overflow page, and that would be my answer. So it worked out really well. Here are some of my Bash projects. So I'm working on 3 Git commands. One is the subrepo is a replacement for submodules and subtree, both of which are not very good. And subrepo is very close to being done. Git super checkout hasn't started yet, but it was an idea that I discussed with Andrew the other day. I can tell you about it later if you're interested. Come find me. It's basically, I'll talk about it some other time. So Bash Plus it adds a few things that make Bash a little bit more like Perl or Ruby, say. It adds a use command or that works like Perl's use or Ruby's require that actually does importing. It calls an import routine, so you can actually do some exports and that kind of thing. Bash already has a perfectly fine way to use or require modules, but it doesn't do importing. So the thing that I use constantly when I'm programming in Bash is the die command that prints out an error, exits, and tells you what line and file it was on, and I modeled it directly after Perl's die command. So that's mostly what I use Bash Plus for. I created an entire JSON library because you really can't do a REST API thing that serves JSON without, you can grep through the JSON, but that's not really right, and it's, you're going to open yourself up to serious security bugs if you try doing that. So I actually have a full JSON parsing framework written in Bash, and you can't write serious code projects without a test suite. So I have a complete test suite, and we'll run some of those test suites and see that they work just like any other test suite. I have an any parser. This thing that I'm showing you these slides in right now is called Live Demo. And I used it a lot more in my last talk. It supports pictures and music and all kinds of neat things, and that's all in Bash. Lola is my idea for local. Lola stands for local language. And who's heard of RBENV? RBENV? It's and it got ported to Perl and some other languages. PLM. It's basically installing copies of Perl and Ruby in your home directory and having several versions that you can switch back and forth. And I thought, well, that's something that should just be a general tool for all languages. Unfortunately, I haven't had that much time to work on Lola. But pair up is something, if you ever find me on IRC and we get in a good conversation, I'll give you a little SSH command to run because I've just started a virtual server that has you and me as users. And we go into a virtual TMUX session, and I invite you to start programming with me in real time. So that's the pair up thing, and that's all done in Bash. So I'm going to go through some Bash commands and some syntax and see what that looks like. So the most important command in a programming language, I think, is the thing that pulls in modules or packages. In Python, it's import. In Perl, it's both use and require. And in Ruby, it's require. In JavaScript, it's require. So that's important because people can write libraries that do useful things, and then you just pull a bunch of them in and write 20 lines of glue code, and you're done. And Bash should not be any different than that. Okay, so here's some assignment. And here we see a couple ways in which Bash shines. We're setting foo to the string oh hi. Now, in Bash, you don't need to quote things if they don't have any spaces in them, and if they don't have any special characters in them. They're just Bash kind of considers everything a string. The second one, bar equals oh hi there, that's defining an array bar. And arrays are actually quite useful in Bash. One of the interesting things when you get really deep into Bash is actually preserving white space, because it is used to divide things so often that when you have a string where the ending white space is critical, arrays are your friend. Let's see. So you'll notice when you assign, in Perl, when you would assign to a variable, you'd say $foo equals or @bar equals. You don't do that, but when you dereference a variable, you use the $sign stuff, and that comes straight from shell. The second one is echoing all of the elements of bar. And then that last line is going through the elements of bar and echoing them one per line. And echo is just like a print, obviously. So here's a few if examples. Interestingly, Bash, well, I guess it's hard to tell the history because Bash came from Bourne Shell, but Perl came after Bourne Shell, but then Bash took things directly from Perl, so it's hard to know what started where. And then when you hear a Ruby fanboy talking about some cool new thing and you know that it actually came from Bourne Shell, you just shake your head in disbelief. That happens from time to time. So in the first case, whenever I dereference a $sign variable, I always put quotes around it. You don't have to if you know that it doesn't have any white space in it. But if it does have white space in it, then it will expand to 2 parameters and it'll have invalid syntax. So I always put double quotes around those. So I'm just saying, are those 2 strings equal? Now notice that's the different, in Perl you have EQ for string comparison and equals equals for number comparison. It's actually the opposite in shell. Now here's something that Bash took from Perl, is the regular expression syntax. And for the most part it works pretty much the same. It's pretty cool. You have to use double square brackets around it, and I won't go exactly into why that is. The or die, that die, as I said, is not a part of Bash, but this assumes that you're using the Bash plus thing. And that's about all that Bash plus. It doesn't really mutate the Bash language at all. It just adds a couple of really nice handy things that you use regularly. Are there any questions at this point? Feel free to make this one a little bit more interactive. If you have a question, yes?
Teammate. Teammate is an instant terminal sharing tool based on TMUX. What's the difference between pair up and teammate?
Oh, I'm not familiar with teammate, so I don't know. But we can talk afterwards. I'd love to see it. Do you use it?
Yes,
Okay.
It's based on TMUX and it generates access key and with no password.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah.
So the question was, what's the difference between the pair-up thing I was talking about earlier, where I'd find you on IRC and throw you into a TMUX session on some remote server and then throw it away after we were done pushing our good work back to GitHub. He was telling me about something called tmake. So the way pair-up works is It spins up a server and it does the configuration, including all the dot files of both users. It merges them together into this ultimate pairing environment. It gets your, GitHub publishes everybody's public key openly. So it actually, if I know, I find out or I guess what your GitHub ID is beforehand, and then it automatically sets that up so you don't ever have to type in a password when you just run the command and you're in the session. So, but I couldn't tell you anything more about Teammate. I don't know.
And another question.
Yes.
There is another shell.
Raise your hand. Oh, same person.
Sorry.
I'm kind of blind.
Another question. There is another shell called Fish. Fish is a smart and user-friendly shell. What's your opinion about Fish?
Okay. So I think everybody heard, but there's a new shell called Fish, and I just happened to pair up with a programmer from Brazil who's living in Kuala Lumpur, and he loves fish. And so, and I looked at it. Fish is a non-POSIX shell, so I would say that's kind of a downside, because if you do a lot of, you have to learn a whole new programming language. But the other parts of Fish, I mean, just if you're using it just as a normal shell and not scripting with it much, then it seems pretty good. One thing I'll note is that everything I do with Bash has a hashbang bash at the front, so you can run it under Fish. It doesn't, you can use the GitHub commands and the pairup commands and all those things under different shells like Z shell or Fish. So my opinion of Fish is if you like it, use it. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going here. So here is a while loop that's reading all of the lines from a file and then echoing them with a little prefix. It's interesting because I don't think I have a slide about this because I wrote all these slides in the last half hour. Sorry. But one of the strengths of Bash programming over other programming, and this is especially true when you're writing command line things, is that who has done IPC programming in Perl or Ruby? You know, where you have to call out to other things and hook up standard in and standard out. That's just so natural in Bash. If you put parentheses around any group of things, it's running in a subprocess, and that means it's shielded off for things. So if you have to set special variables in a special environment, you put parentheses around it. These subprocesses don't slow anything down. There's no noticeable speed. Some of these GitHub commands that I was showing run up to 200 processes, and they're instant. So subprocesses is not a problem, and it's actually a very good thing. All of those subprocesses also have standard in and standard out tied to them, so you can pipe between them. So it's when you're doing that style of programming, it's really an amazing, once you get into it, it's really amazing. Okay, so who's used here documents in various languages? Okay. Here documents is just a way of defining a multi-line string, you know, and they actually came out of shell. Perl stole them from shell, and then Bash actually added the here string. So a here document is a little bit different than it is in Perl. It's actually a document, it's a file. So you would cat it. You can't echo a here document, but you can echo a here string. Yep, we just talked about subprocesses. So in this case, I just put parens around those. Now I'm CDing into a different directory. Now I've just changed my environment. So now I have to CD back. Well, no, I don't, because once I leave that process, I'm back in the process I started at. And I think people use this all the time in just basic shell commands, but it comes in handy within the programs that you write as well. Here's a function. Now this might look a little bit weird to people because what is that colon and that dot doing in the function name? Those are just regular function name characters. And if you use them judiciously, you can namespace your functions, because there are no namespaces in Bash, and there's actually no lexical variables, which I'll talk about in a second, which seems like a terrible thing. But there is some scoping in that you can use this local thing, which is exactly the way local works in Perl, if you're familiar with that. And it's okay. One of the problems I would say with bash is actually returning things from a function. And there's 3 ways to do it. You can use the return command, but you can only return integers between 0 and 255. And you can return bigger integers, but they'll be the modulus of 256. So that's not really so useful unless you're just trying to return true or false, 0 or 1 type of things. What most people do is call it as a subprocess, echo the output they want, and then put it in parentheses so that it gets assigned back into the variable, and that works out fine. Like we see that in the where it says answer equals. The $parens call that as a subprocess. It echoes some stuff out, and that value goes into the variable. It looks a little weird at first, and the $parens are actually also sometimes used as backticks. When I'm programming on the shell, I'll use backticks, but when I'm programming a program or a module in bash, I use the $parens because I think they're a little bit more explicit and easy to see. The other way that you can return a value is to just agree on a variable that you're going to have that function assign into, and since they're all global, it works. So you kind of have to make up your mind of how you're going to do returns. So, as I said, everything is global except for when you localize a variable, it starts a new global scope for everything. It's not local or lexical to that function, but it saves the old value, and then for everything in the global variable of that process and then any subprocess, use the new thing. And then when you leave that process, you're back to you leave that function actually, you're back to the original value. Once you get used to it, it's quite okay. You can do everything that you can do with lexical variables, or most of it. You can't do closures and some metaprogramming things, but you'd be surprised. Okay, so everybody knows the JSON data types. Bash has hashes, and they really are, I think they're garbage. So I don't use them at all. And actually, you'll wonder how in the world I did a JSON without hashes, and I'll show you. So I have 2 more slides in this little section. All of the documentation, and it's a lot, is in man bash. If you do man echo, you get nothing because echo is actually a shell command of bash. So you're not going to find a man page for it. But if you were to read and understand man bash, you would be a much better programmer. I don't know that I've probably maybe understood a third of it so far, and I've done more than anybody I know with bash, but it's really deep and does incredible stuff. And finally, I wanted to mention BPAN. Everybody can maybe guess what that stands for. Seriously, yeah. I'll show that at the end. So, okay. So this is a little command that I ran earlier in my last talk called GitHub user. Hold on a second. And it's just going to give some user information about Ingy.net, who is me. And you can see the number of followers and everything that I have. So it's just a bash command that I was talking about earlier. Now let's go into the actual repo of this. And so this is what it looks like. It has a make file. It has a library with a bunch of stuff in it. It's a plugin-based system, and those all go under a command. It uses the JSON library and the other externals. Since BPAN and that kind of environment, Ruby gems isn't really set up for bash yet. They're actually sub-repos, which I was talking about, submodules, but it's the new sub-repos under ext. And then I have a test directory, and we can actually, let's try that right now. We'll say prove, which is from Perl, but it's kind of ubiquitous these days. So this is a tap test framework, and it's running a bunch of tests. These are all mocked up API tests using packets that actually came from GitHub, but I store them locally. So yeah, there's a test suite that just passed. That's a bash test suite. The tests are written in bash, the test suite framework is written in bash, and I just use prove, which is a general tap test framework to run it. I also, since we're running out of time a little bit, I'm going to show, this is the JSON output of the GitHub user command after it's been parsed. Now, do you see the stuff at the top of the screen? It's all of the leaf nodes of that JSON output. I could show you the JSON output, but you can imagine what it looks like. If you were running it yourself, use the -O command, and it'll give you the output. So I have a path, which is, and it can have multiple components for each key. Numbers are arrays, and then the actual string values are the numbers are true and false and null. And then, so that's how I do deep data structures in Bash with JSON. And it works out pretty good. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some real, wasn't quite where I intended to land. So we use the GitHub user command. This is it. It's these two functions. I'm doing the API call of a get to users and then the user variable. This get args is another function that's quite complex, but it uses this little DSL to say, get the user that the user specified, or if it doesn't exist, call the get user function. So it does its magics, and then $user is set. I do the, if we were to look at the curl output, it's just a curl command that calls this API endpoint, and here's the message I use if it doesn't work out. Then I have a reporting system. I define this array of the things that I want to report, and report data just smartly knows how to lay out all that stuff in the beautiful fashion that you saw, including word wrapping and all that kind of stuff. And so if you were to look through this thing, adding new commands to GitHub is as simple as writing these little functions. That's a big one, but most of them are really tiny. So, I'm going to show you one more thing, because we're getting low on time now. In fact, how long do we have? 4 minutes? 3? Okay, thank you. Here's some OO bash, and I haven't used this, and I just started implementing it this week, but and the idea is not actually my own, it's been around, but it could come in very useful. So you have all these idioms for arrays, and you have to keep remembering them from Stack Overflow. It'd be nice if you could encapsulate them into an array. Here's how you would define a new array. So array.new is actually, that's the function name. It's not array class.foo, but it looks like it, and it works like it. So it works out. You actually have to do the assignment variable after array.new. So you take foo is going to be the variable, and array1 is going to be the variable, sorry, and then the 3 values, foo, 42, and ohigh, are going to go into that variable. You're going to push something on it, and then you're going to print the length, and you'll get 4. Pretty cool. So, so I want to show you one last thing. So, and hopefully this works. With people with computers, and I'm not. Was it able to work, Andrew? Okay, for some reason, the live. So Andrew spent all week writing the prototype of bpan.org, and I'll explain how it works really briefly. So it's going to be the CPAN of Bash, and actually it is going to be a model CPAN for anybody that needs, including existing languages. I think I'm going to take Ruby gems and Perl and just convert it over so they can run side by side. To become an author on BPAN, all you do is go and star the BPAN org. If you go to bpan.org, it'll tell you what to do, but basically you go to a repo and star it, and you're an author. And your picture will show up, your Gravatar picture will show up on the front page of bpan.org. And then, not all the details have been worked out, but basically every time you push something that you want to be a BPAN package with a certain tag, with a release tag, it will put that on. So you can, this is a really simple way with using GitHub and webhooks to do package management. And you know, Andrew and I have been wanting to do this for a few months, and we finally did the prototype this week, and I'm pretty excited about it. The CPAN and Ruby gems and all that stuff, this can be hosted on free on GitHub, on GH pages, and it's going to be pretty awesome. I'm bummer that it didn't work out with the network. Andrew's a network expert, and he has no idea why it's not working. So I'll take a couple questions, but anybody have any more questions? Hey.
What kind of the option
Sorry.
parser?
Say again?
Option parser do you use? Get opt or get opts? I know there are two functions that parse the options, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question and something I really wanted to show. So the question was, how do you do option parsing? This is beautiful. Take a look at the GitHub command, but I use Git itself as a dependency for option parsing because I assume that everybody will have it, and you define a string that's your spec. It's like doc-opt, and it will, when you need help, it will print out that string reformatted to look like help, and when you call it a certain way with git rev parse, it will take the string and your options and normalize them and hand you them back in an array, which you can easily just run a loop over and get stuff out of. It's beautiful. And so there's another thing that I use Git for is ini parsing. If you use the git config command, it's a general ini parser, and it will work on any file that has nothing to do with Git. So those are two parts of Git that are done brilliantly to do git up parsing and ini config parsing on stuff that has nothing to do with Git. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet. Well, I'm out of time, so thank you, everybody, and stick around for Audrey's brilliant talk, which is sure to follow. Thank you.
好，我们谢谢 Ingy döt 的很精彩的分享。那么下一场议程即将在14点20分，由下午2点20分开始。OK， 那么我们 Thanks Ingy döt。